Welcome to The Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I am your host, Blake Fisher, and I'm a political junkie so that you don't necessarily have to be. Thank you for spending some of your valuable time with me today. You may have heard last week, to celebrate July 4th, that Donald Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which, yes, that's its real name, because we can't even pretend that everything's not about Donald Trump, and so we have to name the bills in the way he talks about them. One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Not really sure why the word act has to come after bill. Aren't those kind of the same thing? I don't know. So anyway, I thought we'd talk about what's in the bill. You know, it's hundreds of pages, of course, as always these omnibus are, and they, cram it through and have to pass it on a partisan lines. Just you got to get Republicans to vote. They're not even trying to work with Democrats because they're going through the reconciliation process. And what that does is it allows Congress to pass budget-related bills without requiring 60 votes in the Senate. And so it's a neat way to not have to get any sort of compromise whatsoever. It does limit them to only doing budgetary kind of stuff. So they cannot increase the deficit in a year, but they also cannot, can't touch things if they're not like budget things. So they couldn't pass a new law, for example, that just regulated some sort of thing. They've got to have some sort of budgetary thing connected to it. And so that's why there's all sorts of things like examples. For example, they got rid of the excise tax on firearm suppressors, or what common people call silencers. There used to be this $200 tax that you had to pay if you wanted to buy one of those things and register for it. You still have to do the registration stuff because they can't change that part of the law, but they can change the part where you have to pay the excise tax. They can also get rid of the penalties for some of those kind of things because they're fines, essentially. So basically, Congress has the power of the purse, and that's how they're doing this kind of process. And Democrats have done this, Republicans have done this. This is a way to get a budget passed or get certain bills passed. And like, again, without having to get 60 votes in the Senate, which is important when you've got such a closely divided Senate. Republicans have 53 seats and Democrats have 47. So basically, you can lose 3 votes in the Senate and still get this thing passed because you got J.D. Vance as a tie-breaking vote if it's 50-50, which in fact is how this got passed. It was a 50-50 vote, and J.D. Vance broke the tie because a couple of senators, 3 senators, broke away and didn't vote on this, which is more than didn't vote on it in the House, because this started in the House and then the Senate made a bunch of revisions. People in the House complained about it, of course, because that's what they do. They say all the things that are true about this bill. Probably my favorite one is Chip Roy. Let's see if I can find that graphic. Hold on. This is Chip Roy. Oh, no, here it is. Chip Roy said, fact, the Senate bill increases deficits and violates the terms of the budget deal in the House. Fact, the Senate bill guts the strong provisions to terminate the Green New Scam subsidies in the House bill. Fact, the Senate bill removes key provisions we put in the bill to stop illegal aliens from getting Medicaid. Fact, the Senate bill removes key provisions we put in the bill to stop taxpayer funding of transgender surgeries. Fact, we can amend it, send it back, fix it, and pass both the tax cut extensions and border provisions we all want to pass. Happy to stay here every day until we get it right. You can guess what happened. They didn't even debate this. They actually voted to not even debate this on the floor at all and just passed the Senate things. Only 2 Republicans said no to that. So every other Republican that complained about the Senate version, because the Senate changed quite a bit about the stuff to be able to get even those 50 votes, because this is a huge bloated mess of a bill. It started with what Donald Trump wants and what he promised on the campaign trail, which is things like no tax on tips and no tax on Social Security and no taxes on overtime and all these sort of giveaways to constituents to get their vote in November, which is, a normal thing that politicians do, unfortunately, is they make big promises on the campaign trail just because, for example, you need to win Nevada. And Nevada has a ton of service industry people who work on tips. And it would be nice if you said, hey, you won't have to pay taxes on that. And so Donald Trump, just as much as any other Democrat in the past, because Democrats are normally the ones that pit different tax groups against each other because they say, oh, we can pay for everything. We're just going to tax the richest people more than we tax you. But to me, this is even a little bit more perverse because what Donald Trump is doing is saying, we want to tax different people based on their jobs they have. So if you work in the service industry, you get a tax break. If you are over 65, you get a tax break. If you have an American-made car with a loan on it, there's a tax break for that. And so there's all these things that are basically based on where you work and what kind of industry you work in. I guess the rebates for the auto thing are not exactly that. But so that's what the kind of stuff that's in this bill. And so Republicans were justifiably complaining about the Senate version, but they just passed it anyway. And the truth is they had to make this version that bad to get those 50 Senate votes because slim majority, and you've got people that have different problems with it, and so you've got to make carve-outs for Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. You just have to do that if you want to get her vote, and that's essentially the swing. There were 4 people that were saying they wouldn't vote for this. That was the one person they got to vote on it. So let's talk about actually like what's in it, though, because I think that's important. You're hearing probably a ton of stuff. If you pay attention to this at all, we'll get to what you're going to hear first. I mean, it's mostly going to be people are going to say Republicans voted for tax cuts for millionaires at the expense of kicking millions of poor people off of Medicaid. That's an oversimplification of what's going on, but it's not totally wrong necessarily. But let's actually talk about what's in it, because I think it's worth saying. And you're going to probably figure out what my problem with it is, that it just adds a ton to the debt. It adds $3 to $4 trillion to the debt, and over the next 10 years. And it's clear that Republicans are not serious about being fiscally responsible. Everyone says they're fiscally responsible and for getting the debt and deficits in check when the other party is in power. But once they're in power, it's just spend, 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 spend. And we or our kids or our grandkids are going to have to pay for this stuff. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and we are just kicking this can down the road, and it's immoral in my opinion. So let's talk about what's in the bill. Okay, taxes. It permanently extends Trump's first term tax cuts. So back in 2017, he passed tax cuts, which were pretty broad across the board. This was not they called it a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires, of course, because that's what Democrats and the press are going to say. But it was across the board. People got tax breaks, including a lot in the middle and lower classes. There were huge tax breaks for corporations. It lowered the corporate tax rate. And then Biden undid some of that stuff with things like changing the way that expensing and things could be done in tax purposes. And so this has changed that back. So it has, as mentioned before, it has the new deductions for tips. So it just extended the ones that we had in 2017, but added deductions for up to $25,000 of rebates for tips, auto loans on American cars specifically, overtime pay, ways to not tax that, Social Security kind of. It doesn't really not tax Social Security benefits. It just has a deduction for people over the age of 65, period. So that's how it sort of gets around actually making that happen. It expands child tax credits. And it also extends student loan interest deductions. It changes corporate tax rules so that it expands research and development write-offs, as well as expensing equipment 100%. Biden had changed some of that stuff. Also, it increased SALT deductions. SALT are state and local tax deductions. This was something that happened under the first tax cuts. Reduce those quite a bit, because what happens is in states with higher income taxes, like New York, California, for example, the federal government was allowing you to deduct a portion of that you pay to state taxes from your federal taxes. And so what essentially it was is a way for people that were paying high taxes, so especially the richest people in the bluest states, were paying less in federal dollars for taxes because they paid so much in state taxes. And so what it essentially did was say, if you pay a lot of taxes in the state, you don't have to pay as much to the federal government, which means we are subsidizing as taxpayers those states' gigantic welfare programs, because we're essentially saying, okay, California, you have a super high tax. So we'd reduce that under Trump's first plan to $10,000 of deductions. That's been moved up to $40,000. It has an expiration date in like 2029, but no one believes that they're going to give someone a tax increase in 2029. So that's the other trick of this reconciliation process, is that a lot of it ends up being tricky math. The reason Trump's tax cuts in 2017, you notice they were going to end in 2025. And that normally Congress, when they do budgetary kind of things, they do like 10-year things. And they don't make things permanent a lot of times, because making stuff permanent would change that deficit. And so you wouldn't be able to do it under reconciliation rules. So one workaround that they do with this is that they say, okay, well, we will figure out the length of time we can do this for, that it doesn't cause the deficit that makes us not be able to do this via reconciliation. And then we will deal with that when the time comes. Of course, Donald Trump thought if you did a bill that was 8 years down the road and he gets reelected in 2020, it's not his problem in 2025. Someone else would be president right now. He did not really understand that, who would have guessed that he would lose in 2020 and then win in 2024 and then be the president that had to deal with this again. And so they're doing the same thing now with some of this stuff. So, for example, so these sort of SALT deduction stuff, they're going to expire in 2029 when the next president has to deal with this. And the next Congress, well, actually 2 Congresses from now, is going to have to deal with this. And so it's a tricky way to say, oh, look, we're not really creating this much debt. This pays for itself. But in 2029, Congress is going to have to pass a bill that either redoes these SALT deductions or increases people's taxes. And, politicians don't like to generally increase people's taxes because it's not popular. So people are going to have to run on some sort of version of this. And so that's the trick here. And there's a lot of that stuff in this bill. There's a lot of stuff that expires in 2029. And therefore, but there's nothing, the famous quote is, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. And there's a lot of that in here. Okay. So that's sort of some of the tax stuff. It also does a permanent and inflation adjusted exemption for up to $15 million of gift and estate tax stuff, which I'm for. The estate tax really has always bothered me because as someone that thinks that there should be low taxes, you've already been taxed on all that money that is in your estate. If you are a rich person and you have worked your whole life and you've built a company or something like that, and you've paid all your taxes throughout your life, why then do we tax that money when it goes to your kids? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. To me, that's double taxation. There's a lot of situations of double taxation in our tax code that I think need to be changed. So I'm generally for this provision. Although the problem with a lot of this stuff in the bill that you're going to hear me say is that I am for this in general. I think this is the right idea. It's just that when you reduce the amount of revenue that the government's going to get, you should also reduce the amount of spending we're going to do. You've got to offset tax cuts with cuts to the budget. And we're pretending we're doing that, sort of, not even really, because even as is, this is going to add $4 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. 3 to 4 trillion is the estimates. And that's if everything goes, that's like the optimistic version of what will happen. So they're not, I'm for tax cuts. Generally, I'm just for them being responsible in the sense that we need to pay for them in some way. There's also these Trump accounts. Of course, they're calling them Trump accounts that are sort of similar to already existing accounts that exist for child kind of stuff. You can put $5,000 per kid born in the next 4 years. You can basically put $1,000. It gives a $1,000 basically tax credit to put into this account, and then you can put up to $5,000 in it. It's gross tax free till they turn 18, and then it turns into like a traditional IRA. And we should encourage child savings accounts, but we already sort of had them, and this is just kind of, I think, a reason to give Trump's name on them, because he wants the glory for this kind of thing. All of the tax stuff, all of it complicates the tax code. And my biggest problem with taxes is that we have a very, very complicated tax code. And everyone agrees that we need to simplify it. It's like 900 pages long or something. I can't remember. It's incredibly long now. And anytime you make something complex, you make it a commodity for people that have money to navigate the complexity. And so you make it where the average person, like all of these things, the way they did no tax on tips, the way they did no tax on overtime, the way they did the Social Security deductions, the way they're doing all this kind of stuff, it's adding to the bureaucracy. It's adding to the red tape. It's adding to the complications of how someone would have to do this. And I think they could have taken this opportunity to simplify the tax code potentially, but they didn't, because that would take work, and you'd have to work with Democrats to do that. You can't change the tax code under reconciliation. You can change what we tax, but you can't actually say, okay, we're going to change this. You can't say, we're going to simplify this thing. I guess not, because it just doesn't make a lot of sense. This is the way we did it. But so that's my biggest problem with all this tax stuff, is that what we have is a situation where we have reduced taxes, which, like I said, I'm generally for. But in this situation, we're not paying for them, and we're also not doing a good job of simplifying the tax code. I think that what you want is, most economists agree, what you want for good tax policy is you want like low taxes, but widely spread across the entire population. So you want it to be easy to understand. As this train is going on in the background, it drives me crazy. I actually only hear it when I'm on a microphone like this, though, and I have headphones on. It's kind of a weird thing. I've just blocked it out of my normal hearing. Anyway, so that's the problem with the tax stuff. To me, it does too much Too much cutting, not enough cutting in spending, and then we have that problem. So it does other things though. It does some energy stuff. Specifically, obviously, it is tilted towards gas and oil, which makes sense coming from the Republicans. I mean, we wouldn't expect anything else. It repeals a lot of the tax credits for renewable energy and electric vehicles. I am absolutely for the tax credits being revoked for electric vehicles because for the most part, electric vehicles were things that were sort of a luxury. Most of the electric vehicles, especially throughout this first, I'd call it a sort of first wave of electric vehicles, Teslas, some of the higher end stuff, were higher end vehicles and they were already more expensive. And this didn't ever feel like a way to make the technology cheaper. Sometimes I'm okay with government subsidies for an industry that we wouldn't otherwise get without the government helping them out. Although I'd still rather them just do that with loans. I think that's the better way to do that is to give loans to innovative companies that maybe wouldn't be able to get them in traditional loan areas, get those from the government, but then get paid back on them potentially. Whereas these credits are just basically it's like a $7,000 check to a rich person that was going to buy the Tesla anyway and could afford to buy the Tesla anyway and wanted to because they, a lot of people, especially 10 years ago, for example, a lot of people buying electric vehicles were wealthy. They were kind of sort of people that wanted to pat themselves on the back to say, look at me, I'm so good, I have an electric vehicle. We didn't need to give them a tax break for that, in my opinion. And so it's one of those weird situations where the conservative me says we shouldn't be giving tax breaks for rich people to buy a certain kind of vehicle. It helps the electric car companies in ways that are not market based, and then it helps rich people that don't need the tax break. And I think that that's a bad way to do incentivizing of this kind of thing. But everyone's sort of happy about it because the rich people like it, the green people like it. Everyone's happy, and so I'm glad that those ones are gone. It also sets some limits on environmental reviews, on energy production permitting. The tricky thing here about oil and gas that this is going to affect is that if you've noticed, oil is down in which, this is the problem with a Republican president, the fine line they have to run. And I just don't think that Donald Trump is up to that task because I don't think he thinks complicated about these kind of things. I don't think he thinks these things are very simple and they're not. They're very complicated. He wants to drill, baby, drill, and he wants to have energy production of oil and gas specifically in the United States. And some of his policies actually make it harder to drill, not because of permitting and not because of costs and things, but because the price of oil is down. And so, there's just not as much of an incentive for the oil companies to drill when the price of it is too low. And so that's when you see these kind of booms and busts and you see these contractions and they stop drilling and then they start, this is how the industry works. And sometimes, you probably will, this will continue to drive down the price of oil. That can be good and bad. It's good for your wallet as an individual because you get cheaper gas at the tank potentially, especially if Saudi Arabia and the Middle East are also pumping out a bunch of oil and it makes global prices low. That's, a good thing for your wallet. But if you, if you do care, if you actually want the oil industry and the natural gas industry to, flourish in the United States specifically and compete with other people, sometimes you don't want to push those prices too low or they won't produce. So it's a tricky kind of thing. I think the stuff I've read so far is actually the stocks on, so oil has dropped. So since Trump became president the second time, so being inaugurated in January, oil prices are down and green energy prices for like solar and stuff are up, despite these things and despite those subsidies going away and some of these things, some of the Inflation Reduction Act being sort of undone, some of it, not a lot of it, with this act. So it's kind of an interesting thing in that Donald Trump likes to harp on renewables. I am an energy across the board, like let's do everything all the time and let's not pick winners and losers. I think that you've got to let the market figure that out. There are certain situations where it is worth having, for example, we do have to have permitting on federal lands and things like that. And so that's a process that has to happen. I am for making that easier. I'm for deregulation and cutting red tape wherever we can when it doesn't affect the true safety of something, or, lives aren't going to be lost or something. But, I'm generally not for subsidizing solar, but also not for like banning it. And I'm also for, like, if you want to do wind, and that's the other thing, it's like the federal government's kind of against wind and solar and a lot of this stuff, but the states are not stopping adopting this stuff because they realize most people are smart enough to understand, like, you want a little bit of everything. Like, it's good to be diversified in all of these kind of things. You cannot run the electricity grid off just solar or just wind, or like, you can run it on just natural gas or coal or something, but generally you want to have a mix of stuff. I mean, I think we should have more nuclear, for example. I don't think this bill did anything about nuclear. So anyway, that's a little bit about the energy stuff, just briefly. Healthcare wise, this is where all the bugaboo stuff is. This is where all the headlines are going to be, is that the headline again is going to be Medicaid cuts. Millions are going to go off of Medicaid. I'm going to explain in a second why that's probably not going to be the case. So some of the things that they changed, first is they're going to do work requirements for Medicaid. You're going to have to work 80 hours a month. So that is, not a lot. That's a part-time job, essentially. And that only applies to able-bodied, so not disabled people who are aged 18 to 64 and do not have dependents. So that is people that don't have kids. That's even for, people that, don't have kids or any kind of dependents. They're not disabled people. We're not kicking disabled people off Medicaid. But you have work requirements. Now, this is going to add, again, another thing that I don't like, more bureaucracy and paperwork and things to this mix. Now, it's not just work that you can do. You can do like community engagement, which means that states, the tricky thing here is that basically they were saying, we've got to make this work in reconciliation. Again, we've got to show that we're going to like reduce the number of Medicaid people that we have. And so that's going to reduce Medicaid spending over the next several years. It's not actually cuts to Medicaid. All the headlines are going to say it's cuts. Now, maybe you would accuse me of talking about semantics here, but I think it is important to the difference between a cut and sort of what we're doing in this reconciliation process. A cut would be the budget for Medicaid this year was, let's just call it $500 billion. It's actually more than that. But let's just say it's that. And next year, you would say, okay, the budget is $400 billion, and you've got to cut 20% of your budget. That's a cut. What this is doing is saying we're guessing by reducing the number of people that are on the rolls, because a lot of people have added to Medicaid since COVID, a lot of people, and unemployment has not gone up. So we know we have a lot of people who are employed and on Medicaid. And the federal government is basically trying to say in this bill, we don't think you should be on Medicaid anymore, because we think you should either go to the private insurance group or the Obamacare sort of stuff, that kind of market, or get it through your employer. But we don't think you should be doing it on Medicaid. So we're going to try to get those people off Medicaid we're doing work requirements, but we're also trying to say that you don't, like, the goal would be to get those people off. And in the budget, they get to say, we're estimating that this many people will be dropped from Medicaid, and therefore we are going to reduce the amount of spending that we expect to be doing over the next couple of years. So really what would happen is that we know we're going to spend more next year on Medicaid and the next year on Medicaid, and we're slowing that rate of increase every year. And that's how they're saying these are cuts over the next 10 years, is that they're slowing the rate of the increase of the Medicaid budget. Some people would say, okay, those are the same thing. You're still spending less than you planned on spending in the future. I don't call it a cut unless something actually, the budget reduces from where it was this year to next year, not just based on inflationary kind of things, but this is because more and more people are on it. But the truth is, what happened with Medicaid is that they're basically saying, we're doing this math to say that people are going to be not on Medicaid, but we're telling the states and the hospitals, don't worry, we're not really going to kick anyone off, and you're not going to get any less money for this. And that's how they got people to go on board with it, because community engagement is one of the things that you can be doing. That means a state is going to be able to say, well, community engagement is if you go volunteer at the local school once a week, we'll call that local engagement or whatever. And then that way we can tell the federal government, yeah, they're not working, but they're doing community engagement. There's no definition of what that is really in this bill, from my understanding. And so the states can just make it up, which means that probably we actually will not see many people be off Medicaid. We probably will not see that number of enrollees go down very much. The bill also eliminates enhanced matching funds for emergency Medicaid for undocumented immigrants, which Again, a thing I'm okay with. If you come here illegally, I don't know why I need to be paying for health insurance for you. Let's do it the right way, and then let's talk about it. It also reduces payments to states that exceed a 3% error rate for payments made to people who are eligible for benefits, and overpayments made to eligible recipients. So this would be, they're trying to cut down on the waste and fraud here, and trying to make states a little bit more responsible for making sure that they keep that stuff tight. It also prohibits new or increased taxes in states. This is a way that states have been gaming the system for a long time. What happens is that they give the hospital, for example, $1,000 for a thing, but then they tax them on that too at like a certain percentage, where they get maybe $300 back or $30 back or some sort of percentage, and then they bill the federal government for that. And basically they're keeping that tax. It's a way to say, well, we give the hospital X amount of dollars, but then they give us some money in a tax. And they know this is a way that they can reduce their Medicaid budget and make the federal government come in and pay more. So again, it's our federal dollars, our tax dollars, that are going to pay for states to enroll more people on Medicaid, and then skirt the system where the tax, they're saying, oh, we're paying, because the whole thing is states and the federal government, they split these Medicaid costs. And so the states, to get that federal money, have to put some money in themselves. But what this will probably do is make states figure out another either workaround, but because there's a lot of these taxes already exist. So, but they can't add new ones or increase the existing ones. Again, I don't think this is going to work very well. I think you're still going to have a bunch of, it's not going to stop it, because almost every state was already doing this. It just means they can't increase that rate anymore. So it doesn't actually stop it from already, like, it doesn't stop that kind of, what I think is fraud. It's a scam in the sense that the states are saying they're paying for something, but they're getting a kickback in the form of a tax. So we got to fix that whole thing. Then there's just a bunch of unfunded requirements for states to do eligibility checks on providers and patients, meaning there's, again, going to be more bureaucracy, because the federal government's saying, hey, the states, you have to make sure that someone is eligible. You have to make sure they're working. You got to make sure they're working 80 hours a week, and you got to check in every month, or you got to check in every 6 months or whatever. It's going to add more bureaucracy. It's going to add more red tape into the Medicaid system. And part of the reason the costs are so high in the Medicaid system is because it's a gigantic bureaucratic machine, and you got to reduce that. And so Republicans did nothing to reduce the scope of the federal government or the scope of the state governments. And anytime they do these kind of unfunded mandates, it's giving states, they're going to need more resources and more money to pay for this stuff, which means the costs are going to have to go, so costs are going to go up because of these Medicaid cuts. That's my prediction. I think that will happen. You will see medical costs go up because of this, not down. Okay. And that's really the problem we got to tackle with medical stuff, is the cost is so incredibly high. And this bill does nothing to lower medical costs. Nothing at all. It's trying to get some people off of Medicaid. We'll see if that actually works or not. And it's not really doing it. It also does cost sharing for patients. It's up to $35 per service for adults in that expansion population from the Obamacare. And there's some exceptions for this, for like primary care or prescription drugs, rural health clinics. There's always exceptions to lots of things. And but basically some patients are going to have to buy in a little bit. I pay more than $35 in my copay. I don't think that sounds outrageous for someone to go to the doctor. I think this could potentially help with costs a little bit, in the sense that someone might think a little bit more before they go do a service, because it will cost them $35, and that's not nothing. Okay. Now, the problem, as I mentioned, is that this is not going to really help that much. This is Ryan Salam in the Free Press. He says, take Medicaid work requirements, perhaps the most polarizing provision of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. In theory, imposing work requirements should reduce the number of people who are eligible for Medicaid. And so the CBO dutifully found that this policy would generate meaningful savings. In practice, however, state governments can keep people on Medicaid rolls by signing up for part-time community engagement. This is what I was talking about a little while ago. And by making it seem as though President Trump has imposed Dickinson work requirements on Medicaid beneficiaries, state legislatures in Texas, Florida, and other states that have hitherto resisted expanding Medicaid might decide that the program isn't so bad after all, a change of heart that would boost federal spending by hundreds of billions. And so I think that that's really the problem, is that what you have is, this is a way to pretend that we're cutting, but chances are there are some states that have not come into Medicaid expansion, like Texas and Florida, two of the most populous states in the country, who might go, you know what, this is not as bad of a deal for us now. And therefore, we're going to have way more people sign up on Medicaid. So could be the problem there. So, and then we've got border and immigration money that basically gets multiplied by 5 of current budgets over the next several years. Again, the problem is that it only funds through 2029, but it has all sorts of facilities and that says it needs to be built. This is for detention centers for illegal immigrants that ICE is their budget's going up to do immigration enforcement. With the funding only going for 4 years, that means in 2029, you're going to have a bunch of new buildings and a bunch of people potentially in detention in those buildings. And then this budget's going to come up again, and they're going to have to either say, we're going to close those buildings and fire all these people that we've hired, or they're going to extend it and it's going to further the debt and the deficit. I am all for immigration enforcement. I think it is a absolute Biden knows the Democrats owe almost their entire loss in 2024 to their immigration policies. I think that, the economy was important and the inflation was a problem. And I think that might have been enough to hinder his reelection and then Kamala Harris's. But the immigration enforcement was absolutely it was such a thing that we could just see people pouring over the border by the hundreds of thousands, and the federal government just not doing their part. And look, even if you are there are people that think that we should just allow everyone into the country. That they're, I love the sign that's like, there's, no person can be illegal. It's like, that's not what we're saying. We're not saying the person is illegal. We're saying they're an illegal immigrant because they're here illegally. It's not a derogatory term. And my point is that even if you believe that we should have open borders and that anyone should be able to come here and we should give them all the benefits of being a citizen of the United States, even if you believe that, the border security is important because human trafficking is going on right now and has been going on across the border. That's how everyone got across the border illegally, is that they hire cartel to take them across the border. They pay basically a flat sum to try 3 times. That's generally how that worked. And we had no way of vetting who was coming. We need to vet who's coming across the border. We certainly don't want people like drug cartel and terrorists and stuff. And then there's just millions of kids that came across the border. And if we don't have good border security, if we don't have good border patrol, we do not know if those kids are actually with people that they are related to or they're not. We don't know if they're being trafficked. We don't know, trafficked beyond the what they paid for, if that makes sense. Like they're being for sexual exploitation or whatever. That is our job. Once a kid is on our soil, it is our job to make sure that they are safe, in my opinion. And when you try to do these lax border stuff that Biden did, we had no way of doing that. They cannot track where all these kids ended up going. They don't know for sure that they came across with actual relatives. We don't know that they actually got to actual relatives. And I think that there will be, in time, we will find that there was a lot of stuff that was bad that was going on. And so I think it's our job to have more border security. So I'm glad that there is some border security stuff. However, we still need to fix the immigration system because I think that we should have legal immigration. I'm not one of these far righters that thinks that we should just close the borders entirely and that we should never have any immigrants. Because look, chances are you are one of those people whose grandparents, just look at it statistically. Most of us, our ancestors at some point were immigrants, right? I mean, unless you are Native American, fully Native American, then your ancestor at one point was an immigrant. And we've done this every time. It doesn't matter. It was Chinese immigrants. It was Irish. It was Italian. It was there's been these groups of people that have come. Right now, it's a lot of Latin America, right? And we always vilify those people in the moment. But then, I don't remember, I haven't heard anyone complaining about Irish people lately or complaining about Italian people or complaining about and so my point is we need immigration. And the truth is we need immigration because we are not having kids at a rate that is going to be able to replace our population and replace the workforce and things. So we need immigrants to fill those spots, frankly. I mean, just economically, we need them. But we also do need money to have good border security. We need to have an immigration system that can process that kind of stuff, and people need to do it the legal way. this doesn't really fix anything about that legal process, in my opinion. It just adds more border security. It does more for enforcement. It does more for ICE to round up people that are already in the country. And it's not that I'm against these provisions. It's just that, again, it's a bunch of money that is being thrown at a problem without a solution to how are you going to slow this down? Are you going to have more asylum judges? Are you going to open more courts so it is a little easier to make the process for becoming a citizen in the United States? Because I want people to come here the legal way and go through the citizenship process the right way. I also don't want that to be a 20-year process or have more work than is necessary. But yeah, I'm all for, we should be able to decide who we want to bring into the country. It doesn't bother me to say, if you hate America, we don't want you here. And we're going to reject your application. Anyway, this just doesn't do anything for that kind of stuff, but it does a lot of the normal border security kind of stuff. And the problem is, when it comes to border security, really Donald Trump's position of just going, don't come here, has worked pretty well. He didn't really have to do that much. He signed a couple of executive orders, and basically the attitude of the administration is clearly trying to get people to self-deport. The problem is he can't really get the credit for that. So there's all sorts of problems with this immigration. I don't need to go down to that rabbit hole probably right this moment. Okay, so then we have what's like wrong with this. That's the essential what is inside the act. I mean, there's a bunch of other little stuff in there because they had to give carve-outs to all these individual House members and Senate members because, we need your vote. And so, for example, like Lisa Murkowski, as I mentioned, in Alaska, they put something about Medicaid in there because their state has a lot of, I can't remember what the situation is, but it's a carve-out just for Alaska, essentially. There are carve-outs for all sorts of things like that where someone needed it. A lot of the stuff that was going back to that Chip Roy tweet where he was saying, here's all the things the Senate bill does that we don't like. All those things that he said are true. The reason the Senate had to do those things is to get the votes. And so one of those things, for example, is you cannot... they had to walk back a lot of this stuff in the border security stuff, in some of the Medicaid stuff for illegal immigrants, so there's just all sorts of things that you have to do carve-outs because that's when you've got such a slim majority. That is how Congress works. The 4 people in the House and the 4 people in the House and the 4 people in the Senate that they know they're the swing. They kind of have the president and the rest of Congress by the balls. Forgive the expression. And so you get little carve-outs for stuff. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff in the bill too, that I don't think necessarily will, it's just how we have to pass bills now because Congress has refused to do things in a way that, is going to get any buy-in from the other party. And Democrats do this and Republicans do this. And what you always end up with is you have to do little carve-outs for everyone, which means that everyone wants money. And that's why the Inflation Reduction Act, which didn't do anything about inflation. It was really just a green policy deal. Most of those Democrats were smart in the sense that they spread that money out to red states too. Well, guess what senators and Republican House members in red states don't want to do is take money away from their constituents that they got with these green subsidies, so they didn't fight those a lot either. Basically, once there's money in something, Congress is very unlikely to take money away from it. And so everyone says they're for fiscal responsibility, but no one actually wants to make a cut to the thing that they care about. But we're going to have to make cuts to this stuff eventually because what's bad about this bill is that it adds $3 to $4 trillion to the national debt that's already at like $36 trillion over the next 4 years. We cannot keep spending this way. We are now spending so that is now 121% of GDP. That is now, we're spending 7% of a GDP just on the debt. So just on the debt that we have, just the interest on the debt, we are paying 7% of GDP. 7% of our entire economy, the money that our entire economy makes, we have to spend 7% of that gigantic chunk on just the interest on the debt, which is quickly coming up as our highest expense other than Social Security and like the entitlements that we have. This cannot continue. We have to talk about Social Security. We have to talk about Medicare. We have to talk about Medicaid. And we have to talk about a bunch of the little stuff too. The problem is Republicans are pretending that they could send DOGE in there and cut a couple of programs that cut, the highest number that DOGE says they cut was, which I don't think is true, is $160 billion. the budget for this year is going to be $6 or $7 trillion. It is a drop in the bucket. It's nowhere near what we need to do to be able to get our finances under order. And so I think that's a huge problem. So, but to me, this is like everything that's wrong. You've got small majorities mean that, you've got carve-outs for specific legislators. You've got Trump's arbitrary deadline of July 4th. And so the House did not take this up for talking again. They didn't kick it back. This should be a process that starts in committees and moves up to the floor. And we should have discussion, even in a reconciliation process. Even if you only want to do it within your party, there needs to be more discussion. But this is all top-down leadership. Here's a $900-page bill that you're voting on in a few hours. It's in the middle of the night, and if you don't vote for it, you're with the enemy. That was the messaging on all of this. It's not that, and so you have all these Republicans that are saying this is a bad bill. These are terrible changes that the Senate made, and it was a bad bill when the House made it too. Honestly, it wasn't a good bill when they put it together either. But it got worse in the Senate, and everything they said. I know I just did the Chip Roy thing, but there were a bunch of other quotes too. Everything they said is right about this. It was a bad bill. It's going to add a ton to the deficit, a ton to the debt, and but they voted for it anyway, because if they don't, Donald Trump's going to primary them. So they have to get in line. And there's this stupid thing in Republicans, and this is what drives me crazy, is there's nothing conservative about this. Fiscal conservatism is that is one of the huge pillars of conservatism, in my opinion. Or at least how I feel about it. Obviously, that's not how anyone in the Republican Party feels anymore, as long as Donald Trump is the president. He added $7 trillion to the national debt in his first term. 4 of that was before COVID even happened. And he's going to add at least $4 trillion to the national debt, because this is his, that's all. We're only 5 months into this thing, right? So he alone is going to add about, at least $11 trillion to the national debt. That is wild. It's basically a fourth of the national debt is going to be one president. It's unsustainable, and we cannot keep doing it. And so you can pretend to be conservative and you can say that you're for fiscal responsibility, but the Republican Party is not for fiscal responsibility at all anymore. And this proves it, because Donald Trump can just say, I'm going to sign this on July 4th, or I'm going to primary you. And Republicans have something in their head that says, well, it's better me to be there, a reasonable Republican, than some crazy MAGA person. But my question to them would be, what is the difference between you and the crazy MAGA person if you just go along with what Donald Trump says every single time, no matter what anyway? Because that's what you're doing here. So it's add massive amounts to that. Trump's deadline is very stupid. It was arbitrary. It's just, he just has the date that he wants, and he wants what he wants when he wants it, and that's it. It's so dumb. It's also a bet. Donald Trump and Republicans are basically betting that the economy is going to come roaring back. That's the only way this even gets close to potentially paying for itself. But I don't think that this bill, combined with Trump's tariff policy, is going to... Yes, there are business tax cuts. Yes, there are some ways that it helps businesses, and hopefully they reinvest that in their companies and in employees and in making things and selling things that actually grow our economy. Maybe businesses move here. We'll see. But I don't know if they will, because of the tariff policy. I think that if the one way that some of this stuff in the bill would potentially work to help the economy is if the Supreme Court strikes down Donald Trump being able to arbitrarily add tariffs. He did so again this week on Japan and Vietnam, I think. I'm already forgetting. Just arbitrarily, hey, these two places are paying 25% tariffs or 50% tariffs or whatever. Whatever he decides it's going to be that day. Businesses can't operate not knowing what their expenses are going to be, and everyone is kind of playing this waiting game. And I think that that's why the economy is kind of just doing this right now. It's not really rising or lowering. It's just stocks are kind of doing this depending on what the announcement is from Trump. And so if someone could rein in Trump on the tariff stuff, maybe this tax policy on corporate stuff would actually help and we could get going economically. But, we'll see if that happens. But that's the best case scenario, is that if the courts strike down Trump's ability to levy tariffs the way he is, it would, first of all, Congress should be the people that do that. Congress should be the people that step in and say, actually, you know what, we're going to take our power back. This is arbitrary what you're doing. But Republicans will not do that to Donald Trump. They will not do that. You could potentially maybe see Democrats doing that in 2026, but I don't see Republicans doing it. And so in the meantime, everyone is basically counting on the courts to do their jobs. And I would bet that Republicans in Congress are hoping the courts strike down Trump's so that they don't have to be the bad guys, because they can't, obviously judges can't be primaried and they can't be removed by the president, or trust me, the president would have done so by now. And so anyway, we're going to be in a bad situation. But that's the best case scenario, I feel like, for Republicans right now. But if it's just not a good bill. It's basically the same kind of bill that we've seen over and over again for the last couple of decades from Congress. It's an omnibus, team sport politics kind of thing. It's top-down leadership. It's not committees bubbling this kind of up. We're not discussing this on the floor. We're using reconciliation to bypass the way Congress is supposed to make these kind of budgets and laws. And so we're finding ways to skirt around the rules to make things work. And I think it's a bad way of doing business, a bad way of doing government. It's just not working. It also does almost nothing, by the way, in this bill that prevents the Democrats from undoing all of it the exact same way in reconciliation, because so much of it is not permanent law. And again, we're just kicking the can down to like 2029 and some of this kind of, in some of these provisions. I don't think it's very likely that you're going to see like Democrats can just undo that suppressor thing, for example, because they didn't change the law to where suppressors are just legal and you don't have to pay a tax on it. They just got rid of the tax. Well, the Democrats can just come in 2 years if they win the House or the Senate and say, we're going to add that tax back. And so again, it's just uncertainty for American people. It's not that this law changed and now this is no longer, it's like we're just taking away the financing for it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I do want to talk about one thing that's good, because I don't like the bill. I think it's bad. I didn't talk a lot about it leading up to it because I knew it would be bad and I knew this would be the process. But I do I like to highlight government working sometimes. It does happen on rare occasions. And so this is a situation where it's, of course, not the federal government. It is a state government. So I want to talk about Virginia. So there's a Forbes article this week about how Virginia it actually started under Governor Ralph Northam, trying to do some regulatory rollback of sorts, because Virginia was one of the most regulated states in the country. And so Ralph Northam was a Democrat. He started some of that, but then Glenn Youngkin, the current governor, when he came in, he said no, we're going to supercharge this thing. Created an office of, Office of Regulatory Management. It has 4 people in it, and they have managed to actually do a lot of work. They had a goal of 25% reduction in regulatory goals. So basically, if there's 1,000 pages of regulations, they want to get that down by 25% to 750 pages. That's sort of how they were counting on stuff. So they had a goal. And DOGE really has nothing on my favorite boring politician, Glenn Youngkin, on this. And so Forbes was talking about how they did it. So via the article, on July 8th, Government Youngkin announced that the Office of Regulatory Management, ORM, which he established by an executive order in 2022, had reduced 26.8% of regulatory requirements in Virginia Administrative Code, yielding more than $1.2 billion in annual savings for Virginians. ORM also worked with state agencies to cut 11.5 million words from state guidance documents, or 47.9% reduction. Real results that affect real Virginians, okay? This is actual money and actual time that these regulations were getting in the way of, and this is now savoring. So this is just savoring. Okay, so here's some of the things that it did. It lowered the cost of new home construction by $24,000 per home, saving home buyers $723 million per year so far. Occupational regulation changes cut approval times from 33 days to 5 days. So this would be like regulatory stuff on haircutting or cosmetology or any sort of where the government has to give you some sort of thing that says, yeah, you are licensed to do this kind of thing. So that occupational regulation cut approval times from 33 days to 5 days. That's $179 million in annual additional worker earnings because of that delay being shortened. Okay. It also did stormwater permitting process updated for $124 million in savings, a total of $1.2 billion in annual savings, 70% faster permit processing at the Department of Environmental Quality, A simple example of this, by the way, is the Board of Social Services eliminated the notarization requirements for childcare forms. So this would be, you have to go take for this form, I guess you had to go take it to a notary, get it notarized. They got rid of that part. This saves $900,000 a year. Board of Cosmetology, again, we're talking about hair cutting and stuff. Reduced training hours from 1,500 to 1,000 hours for some cosmetologists, which saves $2.7 million annually. Department of Elections got rid of the witness signature requirements for absentee ballots, which cut administrative costs by $7.1 million per year. So these are all things that everyone would agree we're no less safe because of this. Like, if the person that went to cosmetology school that's doing your nails or hair or whatever it is that they're doing has 1,000 hours of training as opposed to 1,500 hours of training, like, do you really think that there is any danger to the public in that situation? No. It also gets people jobs faster in these kind of things that, first of all, I think that we should deregulate a lot of these sort of work requirements for cosmetology. New Jersey had a famous one for hair braiding. You had to get a license to be able to braid people's hair. It's a ridiculous notion that anyone should have to get a permit from the state to be able to braid someone's hair, but that's the kind of stuff that we have in this country. And so Virginia's doing real work to deregulate stuff. And I don't see anything in these reports that goes, ooh, I don't know, that seems like a safety problem to me. This is actually lowering the cost. It's lowering the bureaucratic red tape. It is lowering the cost of governments, lowering the cost of taxpayers, getting people working faster. These are all good things. And by the way, this is one office, again, with 4 employees put together by Governor Youngkin. The downside to all of this is that it's mostly been executive orders, which I rail against at the federal level, so I should at the local level too. I mean, the hope in Virginia is that because this started under a Democrat and then ramped up under a Republican, maybe, like, hopefully the citizens will see that this is a good thing and they will reward that kind of behavior and not elect someone that's going to come in and undo all this stuff. But the problem with executive orders, even at the state level, is that they can just be undone by the next administration. So Virginia and other states that are trying to do this should codify this kind of stuff into law and actually go through the legislative process. The problem is, they can't a lot of times because, for example, you know who doesn't want those requirements for cosmetology to go down? People in the cosmetology industry. They don't want more competition. They don't want it to be easier to get into that industry. And this is the case with every industry, is that they want regulations. That's, again, while Facebook, I say this all the time, that's why Mark Zuckerberg's going to Congress and saying, yeah, we'd love you guys to regulate social media. Because they have, again, complexity is a commodity for people that have the resources to navigate that complexity. Facebook has the lawyers and people that it needs in place to be able to get around or like work within the regulations. A startup company, Instagram had 12 employees, I think, when Facebook bought them. You know, that a startup doesn't have the ability to get around those regulations. And it goes down to every level like this, whether you're doing hair braiding or cosmetology or whatever, those industries tend to try to protect themselves with more regulations. So it's hard to get a legislation to pass these kind of things because those people pay for those people's campaigns. It's tricky, but that should be how we want things to go so that people can understand and guess and plan for what's going to happen in the future. And executive orders don't necessarily do that because the next governor of Virginia could be some lunatic. I mean, look, we're about to elect a socialist mayor of New York City, literally a communist. I'm not being, I don't throw around socialist and communist like every other person on the right, but, he's a self-admitted socialist and communist. And with their New York City, the head of the place that we think about when we talk about markets and we talk about the economy, like New York City, is about to elect a socialist mayor. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So you could do that in Virginia and undo all this stuff. But I just wanted to highlight that this is good. And it's different than Doge. So how is this different than Doge? Because Doge is the thing that got all the headlines. Elon Musk said he was going to go in there and cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. And I think it's important that we talk about this because there are things that Doge didn't do right that I think Virginia did do right. And so how's it different? So first, Virginia looked at reducing regulation, not just spending. Doge just went in there and tried to cut cost, and it didn't really think about, like, what are the processes here that would cut cost? Not just like, can we get rid of this job to cut cost, but like, can we change the regulation? And that's really where all of this cost comes from, is the regulation. And so you've got to get into those kind of things and be able to change them. So they looked at reducing those regulations, which they have accomplished. I mean, they've gotten past the goal that they wanted to in a mere couple of years. Second, Doge went in with a sledgehammer and just kind of like, broke things, often having to rehire people that they fired because they realized, okay, we actually do need that person for the job. They kind of hope that we'll just get rid of everything and then we'll see what we actually need and bring them back. It's not a great way to do this. Virginia went in with a scalpel and said, what are the regulations that we can cut? Where are the words that we can cut? What can we take out of the code? Where are there conflicts here? Because what happens is legislatures and even just like agencies add a lot of new laws or add a lot of new regulations without really looking at the old ones. So sometimes there are conflicting ones. There's all sorts of confusion in it. And, they hired 4 people to create this ORM board, and they go in and went in with a scalpel, and they did the hard work of going, where do we cut the most? Like where are actual cuts to this regulation that save us money? Because the goal was not to just deregulate, but it was also to save money. So they're showing that they've saved money, and it should have future returns too, because you're also saving people time and building processes. It should increase, for example, housing projects because they're going to be faster and cheaper. So it should lower the housing costs. So there's all sorts of good things that come with this. And DOGE just didn't really do anything that has any sort of permanent, because nothing DOGE did even came with executive orders, really. And so they didn't even do the executive order part. So I think that's the other thing. And they also set clear goals. I think DOGE did not go in there with any set goals. All we had was Elon Musk saying we're going to cut $2 trillion. Then he revised that to $1 trillion. He ended up getting, even by their numbers, DOGE's numbers, they didn't even get 20% of that $1 trillion in cuts. And some of that was one-time stuff, not from the actual budget. And so it doesn't really help. And so anyway, I think that DOGE was a failure. I don't think that they really did anything. I am for the goals of DOGE. I'm for cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, and I'm definitely for deregulating stuff. But I don't think the Trump administration has done a great job so far at actually putting their money where their mouth is on cutting these reductions in regulatory environment stuff where we're actually going to see savings of not only money and budget and time, but also we're going to see that trickle down to where people are actually building things and the permitting processes are faster in these things. I think all DOGE did is go in there and create chaos at the federal government. And the federal bureaucracy needs to be shrunk, but I don't think DOGE did it in the right way. I think that Virginia's office did a better job at it so far than DOGE did. And I think that if there's a future of DOGE or a future of this in the Trump administration, it would be nice if they looked at places like Virginia and said, hey, we could do some of those same kind of things. And every state should be looking at this kind of thing too. So, I just got to give props to state governments when they're doing their job, since the federal government is not very often. But that is it for me for this episode of The Homeless Conservative. Thank you for joining me and spending some of your valuable time with me. I really do appreciate it. If you can do one thing for me, rate the podcast wherever you listen to it. That helps a lot. The other thing you can do, if you can do 2 things for me, is you can go subscribe on YouTube and tell a friend about it. Those would be good things that you could do for me. And it just helps me out. This is definitely a word of mouth kind of thing. Because I'm not trying to do the outrage stuff that gets the clicks and the eyeballs. There are plenty of people out there that already do that thing. There are plenty of people that are doing the outrage machine stuff, and I don't want to do that, but that does mean that I need your help spreading the word. So thank you for doing that in advance, because I'm sure you're going to do that now, right? All right. Thanks for joining me. I will catch you next time.